This video will define and provide examples of the basic verb forms and tenses in the English language. All verbs in English have four basic forms, otherwise called principal parts. All the different types of verb tenses that we create come from these basic principal parts. They're kind of the root of verb formations. These basic parts are known as the base form, which is also sometimes called the infinitive, the present participle, past, and the past participle. And here are some examples of those basic forms. You can see the base form is the form that is essentially unconjugated. The present participles generally end in ing. Please just make a note here that the participle form of the verb is not to be confused with the verbal participle that's functioning like an adjective. That's one of the reasons that you'll see here the verbs in brackets, the is under present participle and have under past participle. Because in order for these participles to be functioning as verbs, they need helping verbs with them. And that's what is and have are in these cases. They're helping verbs that allow us to create present progressive verbs and perfect forms of the verbs. Regular verbs generally become the past and past participle forms by adding d or ed. And this is a really easily recognizable pattern. When young children are first learning to speak in English, they notice this pattern and they basically add ed to everything. Sometimes we call it overcorrecting, where even, my daughter will say, I shotted it, I ate it. She adds that ed even if she already has a past tense form because she understands that's the pattern that we use in English. The problem with that arises when we have irregular verbs, and we have many irregular verbs in English. What differentiates an irregular verb from a regular verb is the way that its past and past participle forms are created. So with irregular verbs, it's done in some way other than adding d or ed. So if regular verbs have d or ed, irregular verbs are all the ones that don't do that. And there really is not an easily recognizable pattern. They're all different kinds of ways that these forms can take shape. And so it's the best way to learn it is to just really kind of immerse yourself in it, to become really familiar with it through reading, through listening, through practicing, perhaps even by writing them down and doing a lot of repetition and drills. If English is a new language for you, that's one of the best ways to become familiar with it so that you are able to hear which verb forms are correct. I have here a bunch of the most common irregular verbs in English. I'm not going to read them all to you in these charts. Instead, I'm going to move through the slides kind of slowly so that you have time to pause the video and write them down if you want to do that. You also could take screenshots if you wanted to do that. And then some of you will be working from the notes template that I provided on the school website. And so if you're using that, then you have all of this there for you already. And it can become a useful reference in case you're ever not sure how to form the past or past participle of one of these verbs. Now we're going to shift into talking about verb tense. And I put these together because the different forms or principal parts of a verb are what helps us create different tenses in English. Tense is basically the way that we express things happening at different times. And so Being familiar with the different tenses and what they basically mean in terms of time is going to help us be more precise and accurate in our writing. There are 6 main tenses in English, and all of them are formed from the principal parts that we just looked at. Here is a kind of a snapshot presented in a timeline graphic of those 6 verb tenses. We have simple, past, present, and future, and then we have the past perfect, present perfect, and future perfect. While the definitions are here, I am going to go through each of them one by one over the next few minutes with examples. One thing I want to point out here in terms of the graphic is just to explain some of the arrows. You notice along the perfect column, the vertical lines that kind of run up into the main timeline. Those vertical lines are representing the idea that an action has completed. So that's really what the perfect means. It's an action that either it happened and we're not exactly sure when exactly it happened, but it spans a kind of general time range, but it was completed, it finished, rather than continuing on, which is the progressives, which we're going to get to kind of a little bit later in the video. So moving through the simple tenses, simple present is what's happening right now. We use present tense for a lot of different things in English. One is to show habitual action, so it may not be it's happening right now, but it might be something that happens on a regular, consistent basis, but isn't a continuing action. We would use present tense to state a general truth. We use present tense when we're writing about literature. This is important. This is something that students often struggle with. They want to use past tense because they think, well, it happened in the book and I already read the book. But in English literature, when we're writing about the books, the idea is that we're experiencing it again every time we read it. So we use what's called the literary present to summarize and analyze literature. And then sometimes in history, when we want to make an historical event seem more current, we use what's called the historical present tense. So here's a really straightforward example. He studies hard. So that could be an observation, like my child is sitting at the table studying and I'm looking, I'm like, wow, he studies hard right now in this moment. But it also probably more accurately describes a general truth about his study habits. Whenever he studies, whatever he studies hard. Past tense is, of course, expressing an action that occurred sometime in the past and that did not continue into the present. He studied. So he had a test, he studied. That's it. One and done. Future is an action that will occur later. He will study tomorrow. There's a particular time set. It's not today. It's sometime in the future. So to form that verb, we put will in front of it. The perfects get a little bit trickier. They're not quite as intuitive as the simple tenses, kind of hence the name. Present perfect tense expresses an action or state of being that occurred at an indefinite time in the past. So this is what's confusing about this one. It's present perfect, but it's talking about something that happened in the past, and we use the past participle to form it. He has studied grammar. So if I say he studied grammar, that really means it happened at one specific point in the past. But this idea of he has studied it suggests that it happened over an indefinite period of time. You know, it spanned a range, but it's done now. Like he's not studying anymore. Past perfect expresses an action or state of being that ended before another past action or state of being occurred. And this makes most sense when you see it. So he had studied for hours before he took the test. So the action of studying was completed before the action of taking the test. Note that the action of taking the test is in the simple past tense, took. Future perfect expresses an action or state of being that will end before another future action or state of being. So what you're hopefully picking up on here is that with perfect tenses, we're using them to express something that happened in relation to something else. He will have studied by the day of the test. So He hasn't studied yet, but the studying will take place before the test does. Then we have progressive forms. These aren't different tenses, but they're versions of the 6 main tenses that allow us to express continuous action, so something that is ongoing. And here's the same graphic organizer just with the progressives put in, because they really are, like the past progressive is a form of the past tense, but it's a little bit different because it's more specific. Present progressive expresses an action that's occurring continuously in the present, so it's ongoing. He is studying for the test. The action is taking place right now. We don't know when it began. We don't know when it will end. It's ongoing. And that's really what the progressives are about. It's about an ongoing action. Past progressive is an action that occurred over a period of time in the past. So it's continuous in the past, but it's done now. It's also often used to express an action that was continuous in the past that's interrupted by another specific past action. So an example of the first version, he was studying for the test. So it took place in the past. We don't know when it began or when it ended. He was studying for the test when Sarah texted him. This is a continuous past action of studying. It was ongoing, and then it was interrupted by a specific past action. Again, noting that texted is your simple past tense. So you have an ongoing action that's interrupted by one specific moment, one specific action happening that is not ongoing. Future progressive is an action that will occur in the future and continue over a typically unspecified length of time. He will be studying for the test all week. The action will take place over a continuous time period in the future. So while our sentence does say all week, which we might interpret as being a specified time length, the idea is that it's kind of general. It's not, it's not giving me like how many hours. So if I wanted to say he will study for 3 hours, then I'm just using future. But if it's ongoing, off and on, kind of continuing, he's going to pick it up and drop it again all week, then I'm going to use the progressive tense. All right, now we get into the present perfect progressives, which are the wordiest and most complicated, and the ones, honestly, that you're probably not going to use very much. Present perfect progressive expresses a continuous action that began in the past and continues into the present. He has been studying for the test for several weeks. So he started studying in the past. The act of studying has continued. It's been ongoing for several weeks over an unspecified time period, and it includes the present, like he is still studying. That's why it has been studying, because he's still doing it. Past perfect progressive expresses an action that started in the past and continued, it was ongoing up until another specific point in the past. He had been studying every Sunday until baseball season started. So he was studying ongoing, off and on, every Saturday. But then once baseball season started, that specific thing that happened also in the past, it ended the progressive act. So that's why it's not has been studying, right? If he were still doing it, we would say he has been studying every Saturday. So he was studying for a while, he continues to do it. But once baseball season started, he wasn't doing it anymore. And so that's why it's had been studying, the past perfect progressive. And future perfect progressive expresses an action that will continue up until a point in the future, so beyond even this current moment. He will have been studying for 3 months by the time he takes the AP exam. So if we take what we just talked about, the idea of ongoing, continuous, off and on, it's just continuing that beyond this moment up until sometime in the future. So those are all the different ways that we can form verbs in English. And you might be asking yourself, well, who cares? This is a lot of information. Why do I need to know this? Which is one of my students' favorite things to ask about grammar in general, not just verbs. And the truth of the matter is, it's probably not that important to memorize the different verb tenses and their definitions. Like, to be able to spit back out, well, present progressive is this and present perfect is this. What is really important is to be consistent with verb tense and to use the right tense at the right time. So familiarity with these tenses, knowing they exist and that they're not interchangeable, they really mean different things, should really help you be clear and more precise in your writing. For the most part, your writing will be in the simple present or simple past tense, and this does depend on the type of writing. So if you're writing a literary analysis essay, the bulk of that essay is going to be in the simple present. If you're writing a memoir about an experience that you've had in the past, that's probably going to mostly be in the past tense. Really, the only time that you are shifting out of that is when you need to describe events that occur at different times in relation to the simple present and the simple past. So the bulk of your piece of writing will still be in the present or the past tense, and then you might need to indicate time relationships at various points, and that's when you can bring in some of the other forms that we talked about. But it's important to know that the consistency and the using the simple one, which is our most common form, is what really matters, and that if you're not sure or that you're getting a lot of comments circling verb forms, that you come back and review this, because that's going to help you understand why you're getting those comments about using the wrong forms of the verbs.